Hello friends, I am Mr. Dark, and the story you are going to hear tonight is very scary. You are going to shiver after listening to it. So are you ready for this very scary journey? Let me tell you beforehand that the story is based on real incidents. So let's start. The late afternoon sky in Oregon was thick with clouds, casting an eerie glow over the forested highway that stretched before Ethan, Jake, Rachel, and Lily. It was supposed to be a fun weekend, just the four of them, no distractions, nestled in a remote cabin in the woods. Jake, who'd grown up in nearby Portland, had found the place online and assured everyone it was perfect, private, peaceful, and equipped with a massive stone fireplace. As they drove, excitement buzzed in the car, but as they ventured deeper, the landscape grew darker, more desolate. "I thought we'd be there by now," Rachel murmured from the passenger seat, glancing at the dense trees flanking the road. There was an unsettling quiet about the woods. The towering firs seemed to press in, swallowing up the last of the day's light. Jake, in the driver's seat, gripped the wheel with a faint frown. "Yeah, I'm sure we're close. It's just this last turn." He slowed down, squinting to see through the gathering shadows. A worn hand-painted sign caught his eye. Marigold Trail, in faded letters. Without a second thought, he made the turn. As they continued, Rachel shivered, rubbing her arms. "Does anyone else feel weird?" she asked, her voice trailing off. Lily, nestled in the back seat, looked up from her phone and raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Ethan asked, trying to keep things light. Rachel bit her lip. "I don't know. I just feel watched." Jake laughed. "Rachel, it's just the forest. We're the only ones out here. No other cars, no houses for miles." But Ethan was watching Rachel closely. She looked pale, her fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. "Relax, Rach," he said, patting her knee. "It's just the creepy woods vibe getting to you." They laughed it off, but a nervous energy lingered in the car as they drove further along the trail. The trees grew taller, their branches arching over the road like skeletal hands blocking out the dimming sky. Jake checked the map on his phone, but it blinked uselessly, no signal. "Ugh, it's dead again," Jake muttered, shoving the phone back into his pocket. "Don't worry though, I know where we're going." Moments later, a shoddy cabin came into view, barely visible in the twilight. Set back from the road, the building looked more weathered and uninviting than the online listing had suggested. The wooden beams were grey and splintered, with ivy snaking up the sides. The front porch sagged as if barely able to hold its weight. Above the door was an old wreath, hanging as if it had been forgotten by time. "Home sweet home," Jake said, parking the car, but the cheerful tone in his voice didn't quite match the look on his face. Lily let out a low whistle. "It's charming, in a horror movie sort of way." "Come on, guys, it's just rustic," Jake insisted, grabbing his backpack. "Inside, it's cozy, I promise." They all piled out, grabbing their things and making their way to the porch. Ethan noticed Rachel was lingering by the car, staring off into the dense trees, her brow furrowed. "Rach, you good?" he asked. She looked at him, her face almost ghostly pale in the dim light. Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I thought I heard someone whisper my name." Ethan chuckled, trying to keep things light, but a chill ran down his spine. "You've been watching too many horror flicks. Come on, let's get inside before we freeze out here." Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of damp wood, but Jake was right. It was cozy. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, and thick, handmade blankets were draped over worn armchairs. Lily and Rachel went about unpacking groceries while Ethan explored the cabin, opening creaky doors and peering into dim corners. "Who wants a drink?" Jake called, tossing his keys on a weathered coffee table. He started mixing cocktails, pouring strong ones to break the ice, as he put it. Rachel was quiet as she sipped her drink, her gaze drifting to the window, where darkness had fully claimed the forest. After a while, she wandered to the small bookshelf in the corner, her finger brushing along the spines of dusty books. A tattered volume caught her eye, its title barely legible. Legends of the Northwest. "Hey, check this out," Rachel said, holding up the book. The others crowded around as she flipped through brittle pages filled with strange, haunting stories. One chapter was titled The Marigold Curse. "That's the same name as the trail, right?" Lily asked, a nervous laugh escaping her. Jake waved it off. "It's just local folklore, probably something to scare away tourists." But Ethan felt a strange unease as he read over Rachel's shoulder. The legend described a woman named Marigold, a young mother who had been abandoned in these very woods by her family, who believed she was possessed. It was said that her spirit roamed the forest, seeking vengeance on anyone who trespassed her path, her whispers haunting the living and leading them astray. "Oh, come on," Jake scoffed. "You guys aren't actually creeped out by this, right?" Ethan forced a laugh, trying to shake off the chill that had settled over him. "Of course not. But maybe we shouldn't go wandering into the woods at night, just in case." Jake chuckled, raising his glass. "To Marigold, then. May she leave us in peace." They clinked glasses, though Rachel's was half-hearted. As night deepened, they turned in one by one, exhaustion from the day's journey settling over them. Rachel stayed awake the longest, unable to shake the feeling that something unseen was moving in the shadows outside. When she finally drifted to sleep, it was restless, her dreams full of haunting images. A woman's figure standing by the trees, her face obscured, whispering in a language Rachel couldn't understand. Sometime later, Rachel stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She was standing. Her bare feet were cold against the wooden floor. Disoriented, she turned and saw her friends asleep in their beds. Uncertain of how she'd gotten up, she moved toward the window and looked out, a fog rolling across the darkened forest. In the silence, she heard it, a faint, breathy whisper, her name. A chill had settled into the cabin, creeping up the walls and into the bones of anyone who dared stay awake long enough to notice. Ethan, Jake, and Lily slept deeply, exhausted from the drive, but Rachel lay wide awake. She kept seeing shadows move at the edge of her vision, strange flashes that seemed to twist and distort the walls. Her fingers curled tight around her blanket, her mind racing back to the story of Marigold, the woman who'd been abandoned here, left to die in anger and isolation. Finally, sleep crept over her, though not for long. She awoke with a start, blinking groggily at the empty cabin room. She looked around, heart racing. Why was she on her feet by the window? Her hand was pressed to the glass, so cold that it stung, and outside the forest loomed in shadow. As she turned back toward the bed, her foot landed on something cold and damp, a patch of muddy earth, right in the middle of the cabin floor. "Ethan," she whispered, hoping to wake him, but he was sound asleep, his chest rising and falling slowly. As she stared at the muddy patch, it seemed to grow, spreading like a stain on the wooden floor. She blinked and it was gone. A wave of nausea hit her as she stumbled back to bed, finally slipping into a fitful, dreamless sleep. The next morning the sky was overcast, and a fine mist settled around the cabin. Jake and Lily bustled about the kitchen, making coffee and scrambling eggs, trying to warm the cold cabin with laughter and chatter. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, still pale and withdrawn, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. "Did anyone hear that last night?" Rachel asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. "Hear what?" Jake asked, his tone nonchalant as he flipped eggs on the griddle. Rachel hesitated, glancing out the window at the mist-shrouded trees. Whispers, like someone calling my name. Lily chuckled, but it was forced. Probably just the wind, Rach. I heard a few strange noises too, but it's an old cabin in the woods. A little creaking is normal. Rachel's eyes darkened. It wasn't just creaks, Lily. It was my name, like someone was standing right outside. Ethan, always the calming presence, put a hand on Rachel's shoulder. You're letting that ghost story get to you, Rach. I promise. It's just an old legend. There's no one out there. Rachel forced a nod, but the unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something in the forest was watching her, listening. By afternoon, they'd tried to shake off the eerie feeling by exploring the cabin and its surroundings. Outside, they found an old fire pit, rusted camping gear, and what looked like the remains of a garden, overgrown with wild brambles. Nearby, a small wooden sign, worn and barely legible, read, "Marigold's Rest." "Must be a local memorial or something," Jake said with a shrug. "Or maybe it's where Marigold's spirit still lingers," Lily teased, trying to lighten the mood, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. As they explored, Rachel wandered a bit farther into the woods, compelled by a strange pull. The others called after her, but she barely heard them, her focus narrowing on a spot deeper in the forest where the trees grew thick and twisted. Her feet moved of their own accord, as if she were following an invisible thread through the trees. Then, there it was again, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. Her name. Rachel. She froze, heart pounding, as the shadows around her seemed to shift, forming what looked like the outline of a woman's figure. She could barely make out the face, but the eyes. The eyes were sharp, cold, and filled with something dark and ancient. "Rachel!" Ethan's voice broke through, and suddenly the figure was gone. She blinked, shaking off the vision, and turned to see him standing a few yards away, a concerned look on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, worry clear in his voice. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel managed a weak smile. "Maybe I have." She felt dizzy, disoriented, like something had briefly taken control of her. As they walked back to the cabin together, she whispered, "Ethan, what if the legend is real?" Ethan looked at her, ready to laugh, but stopped short when he saw the genuine fear in her eyes. "Look, I'll admit this place is creepy, but legends are just that, legends. Nothing can hurt us out here." That night, the atmosphere was different, more tense. Even Jake and Lily, who'd been joking about the cabin earlier, were subdued, glancing over their shoulders at every creak and gust of wind. Ethan tried to lighten the mood. "All right, how about we do a little campfire horror story session, get it all out of our systems?" He laughed, but no one joined in. They sat around the fireplace, and reluctantly, Rachel began to speak, her voice barely audible. "There's something wrong with this place," she whispered. "Last night, it felt like someone was here with us." Lily's face paled. "You mean, like a ghost?" Rachel nodded slowly. "I know it sounds insane, but I keep hearing my name, like someone is calling me from the woods." Silence settled over the group as the flames cast flickering shadows on the walls. In the firelight, Rachel's face looked haunted, drawn and pale. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw her eyes flicker a strange shade, but he brushed it off as a trick of the light. As the others went to bed, Rachel lingered by the fireplace, her gaze distant. Her body felt heavy, like she was moving through a thick fog. She closed her eyes and, once again, the whispers started. This time they were louder, more insistent, murmuring her name in the darkness, pulling her toward the window. She opened her eyes and found herself standing, looking out at the dark woods. Her breath fogged up the glass, and her fingers left faint streaks as she reached out, as if trying to touch something beyond the window. And then, there it was, the shadow of a woman standing just within the tree line, barely visible. Rachel's breath hitched as the figure took a step forward, then another. Her face was hidden, but Rachel felt an icy chill run down her spine, her blood turning to ice. The woman's voice, low and almost mocking, filled her mind. "Rachel, come closer." The voice was both familiar and foreign, as if it knew her deepest fears. She felt her hand drift toward the doorknob. Behind her, Lily stirred, glancing toward Rachel. "Rach, are you okay?" The voice snapped, sharp and venomous. "Don't let her see you." Rachel blinked, her hand dropping from the doorknob, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned, meeting Lily's concerned gaze. "Rachel, what are you doing?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with fear. Rachel took a shaky breath, her mind reeling. She could still feel the cold whisper of that voice in her head, like a phantom finger tracing her spine. I don't know," she stammered. I think I was sleepwalking." Lily frowned. "Let's get you to bed. This place is getting to all of us." Back in bed, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the woman's face still imprinted in her mind. Her body felt heavy, as if something else had settled into her bones, some foreign presence that pulsed with anger and malice. She heard the whisper once more, quiet but unyielding. "I will have what's mine." And then silence, cold, suffocating silence. In the other room, Ethan awoke to the faint sound of footsteps just outside his door. He lay still, listening, as the footsteps grew louder, pacing back and forth, almost searching. He held his breath, every nerve on edge, until finally the footsteps faded and a sense of dread washed over him. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following morning, a deep fog rolled across the forest, thick as smoke. It wrapped the cabin in a quiet shroud, muffling every sound, every movement. Inside, the friends tried to act normal, but there was no shaking the tension that had settled like a heavy weight over the room. Rachel was the first to wake. She sat by the window, staring out into the swirling mist with dark circles under her eyes. When Ethan joined her, he noticed her fingers digging into the windowsill, white-knuckled. "Didn't sleep much, huh?" he asked gently. Rachel didn't respond. She just kept staring, her gaze unfocused, distant. "Rach?" Ethan repeated, his voice more urgent now. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes, usually warm and soft, looked cold, almost unrecognizable. Ethan felt a shiver crawl up his spine as she fixed him with a stare that was sharp, intense, almost hostile. "What's wrong?" he asked, keeping his tone light despite the fear prickling at the back of his mind. Her lips parted and she spoke, but the voice that came out was low and unfamiliar. "She won't stop calling me." Ethan blinked, momentarily lost for words. He swallowed, trying to ignore the goosebumps that erupted across his arms. Who are you talking about?" But Rachel didn't answer. Instead, her face twisted into a grim smile, and she let out a low, cold laugh that sent a chill through the room. Then, just as suddenly, her expression softened, her eyes flickering back to normal. She looked around, disoriented, as if waking from a dream. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's going on? I feel strange." Ethan gently guided her to sit down, struggling to keep his composure. "You don't remember, just now." Rachel shook her head, looking terrified. I can't." She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking. "Something's wrong with me, Ethan. I keep hearing her voice even when I'm awake." Ethan wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "We're going to figure this out, okay? We just need some help." By noon, Ethan had convinced Jake to try reaching someone who might know more about the area. The locals at the gas station had mentioned a woman named Doctor. Grace Belmont, a retired psychic and medium who had lived in a nearby town for years, rumored to be an expert on the supernatural. After a few calls, they finally reached her. She arrived that afternoon, stepping out of an old sedan with a steady gaze and a calm demeanor. Tall, with silver-streaked hair and a severe expression, Dr. Grace had an air of authority that demanded attention. She regarded each of them carefully before focusing on Rachel, her eyes narrowing as if she sensed something out of place. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Belmont," Ethan said, glancing nervously at Rachel, who sat silently by the fire, staring into the flames. We don't know what's happening to her. Ever since we got here, she's been different." Dr. Grace studied Rachel for a long moment. "This land holds many secrets," she said, her voice low and firm. "There is a spirit tied to this forest, a woman named Marigold. Her story is tragic. Betrayed by her family, cast out into the woods to die alone. She's been haunting this area ever since, clinging to the living, seeking revenge." Jake snorted, trying to mask his own fear. "So you're saying Rachel's possessed?" Dr. Grace didn't waver. "It's possible. Spirits like Marigold latch onto the vulnerable. They seek out those with unhealed wounds, old fears, and they grow stronger each time they find a new vessel." The words hung heavy in the air. Lily's face paled, and she glanced over at Rachel, who seemed oblivious, her gaze fixed and distant. Ethan cleared his throat, desperate to maintain control of the situation. Is there a way to help her?" he asked. Dr. Grace nodded. "There is a ritual, but it must be done carefully. Spirits like Marigold don't leave willingly. They fight, and if they feel threatened, they can become dangerous." Rachel's head snapped up at that moment, her eyes locking onto Dr. Grace with a ferocity none of them had seen before. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice low and guttural. "You can't make me leave." Dr. Grace met her gaze without flinching. "It's not you speaking, Rachel. It's her." Rachel's lips twisted into a sneer, her hands clenching into fists. "This is my home now. I've waited too long. She's mine." The room fell into a tense silence as Rachel's words echoed, lingering in the cold air. Dr. Grace turned to the others. "I need your help to perform the ritual. Gather candles, salt, anything you have that can strengthen a protective circle. Rachel's spirit is strong, but Marigold's is stronger. She'll fight to stay." As dusk fell, the group prepared the cabin. Dr. Grace led them in setting up a circle of protection around Rachel, who sat in the middle, her head down, her body shivering as if a fever had taken hold. Candles flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls as Dr. Grace sprinkled salt and whispered words in a language none of them recognized. Rachel began to rock back and forth, her breaths shallow, quick. Her head snapped up suddenly, her eyes dark and furious. "You think this can stop me?" she snarled, her voice laced with venom. "I have waited decades. I am not leaving." Dr. Grace didn't falter, her voice steady as she chanted, raising the intensity of the ritual. The candles flared, their flames twisting and writhing as if caught in a wind. Rachel's body convulsed, her face twisted in rage, her limbs jerking in unnatural movements. "You are not welcome here, Marigold," Dr. Grace intoned, her voice powerful, commanding. "Leave this body, leave this place." Rachel let out a scream that filled the cabin, sharp and piercing. Her eyes rolled back, and for a moment her face contorted with a look of pure hatred. Ethan flinched, feeling his heart race as she glared at him, her expression filled with an anger that seemed to cut through him like a blade. "You will regret this," she hissed. "All of you." Lily's hands shook, her face pale, but she held her ground. Jake, too, was tense, his jaw clenched as he watched the struggle unfold. And then, with one final scream, Rachel collapsed, slumping forward, her body still. Silence filled the cabin, and for a moment all anyone could hear was the crackling of the fireplace. Is it over?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Grace approached Rachel cautiously, feeling for a pulse. She sighed in relief, nodding. "Yes, she's free, for now." But the relief was short-lived. Just as Dr. Grace spoke, Rachel's head shot up, her eyes wide and dark, a sinister smile spreading across her face. "Oh, you foolish woman," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Before anyone could react, Rachel lunged, her hands reaching for Dr. Grace's throat, fingers clawing like talons. The others rushed to pull her off, but Rachel was stronger than they could have imagined, her grip iron-tight, her face twisted into a mask of rage. Ethan shouted, pulling at her arms with all his strength, and finally they managed to break her hold. Rachel stumbled back, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. Dr. Grace gasped for air, clutching her throat. She's too strong. The spirit has anchored itself too deeply. We need more than a ritual." Jake looked at her, his face pale with fear. "What do we do then?" Dr. Grace hesitated, glancing at Rachel, who was watching them with a dark, knowing smile. "We need to understand her past. Marigold won't leave until her story is acknowledged, her suffering recognized. We have to find the place where she died, confront her spirit there, and lay her to rest." Ethan swallowed, glancing out the window toward the dark woods that stretched into endless shadows. "You're saying we have to go out there?" Dr. Grace nodded solemnly. "Yes, and we must do it tonight, before her hold over Rachel becomes permanent." Rachel laughed, a sound so cold it seemed to freeze the air around them. "You can try," she taunted, her voice filled with mocking disdain. "But you're just children playing with shadows. You can't banish me. This land is mine." As the last candle flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness, the group realized the depth of their mistake. They weren't just fighting a ghost, they were facing a spirit with years of rage, and Marigold was determined to take them all. The forest loomed like a massive wall of shadows as the group prepared to venture out into the darkness. Rachel's pale, contorted face watched them from the doorway, her gaze filled with something far from human. The cruel smile playing on her lips sent a shiver down Ethan's spine as he tightened his grip on the flashlight. Beside him, Dr. Grace whispered instructions, her voice low and steady. "We need to find where Marigold's spirit is bound," Dr. Grace said, her gaze darting nervously to Rachel, who was now standing eerily still, her eyes narrowed. "The place she died. That's where we'll find her grave, her final link to this world." Rachel's voice broke the silence, soft but laced with malice. "You're not strong enough. None of you are." She laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You can't even imagine what's waiting for you out there." Ethan steeled himself and glanced at Lily, who nodded back, her face pale but determined. The group assembled outside, gathering salt, candles and sage bundles from the cabin, items Dr. Grace assured them would help ward off Marigold's influence. Rachel stayed behind, her gaze following them, a silent, unnerving warning. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the forest, thick fog coiling around their ankles. Ethan led the way, his flashlight slicing through the mist, but every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind seemed to hold a threat, as if unseen eyes were watching their every step. They hiked in silence, the tension thickening as the woods grew darker and denser. Finally, after nearly an hour, they came upon a small clearing. At its center lay a low mound of stones, partly overgrown with moss and weeds, a crude, lonely grave. Dr. Grace knelt beside the mound, carefully arranging candles in a circle. She motioned for the others to stand back, her face drawn and serious. "This is it. We're going to call Marigold's spirit here, but be prepared. She'll do everything she can to resist." Ethan, Jake and Lily exchanged uneasy glances, but they nodded, forming a protective ring around Dr. Grace. She took a deep breath, then began to chant in a low, steady voice, her words carrying an ancient power that seemed to ripple through the forest, stirring the fog around them. At first, nothing happened. The candles flickered, casting long shadows, and a heavy silence settled over the clearing. But as Dr. Grace continued, the air grew colder, and a faint, high-pitched whisper filled the night, growing louder, echoing with an otherworldly wail. The ground trembled, and a dark mist began to rise from the grave, coiling upward like smoke. Within the haze, a figure began to take shape, a woman in tattered, dirt-stained clothes, her face pale and hollow, her eyes empty, yet burning with a relentless anger. Her gaze swept over each of them, lingering on Dr. Grace. "Why, have you disturbed me?" the figure hissed, her voice low and venomous. Dr. Grace's voice trembled as she spoke, but she held her ground. "Marigold, we know of your suffering. We are here to help you move on." Marigold's face twisted with fury, her form flickering in and out of visibility like a shadow caught between worlds. "Move on!" she snarled, her voice shaking with rage. "After what they did to me! They left me here, abandoned, and now you come to take my revenge from me?" Ethan felt a rush of terror as Marigold's gaze fell on him. He stumbled back, feeling the weight of her anger, her hatred like a physical force pressing down on him. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as Marigold's image grew clearer, her form solidifying into something all too real. Dr. Grace raised a bundle of sage, lighting it with a trembling hand. She waved it toward Marigold, chanting louder, her voice gaining strength. "We acknowledge your pain, Marigold, but you must release this girl. She is not the one who hurt you." Marigold's eyes narrowed, her mouth curving into a cruel smile. "I don't care. She was weak. She let me in, and now she is mine." With a sudden violent burst, Marigold lunged toward Dr. Grace, her form distorting into a mass of darkness and cold. Dr. Grace stumbled back, the sage falling from her hands as Marigold's shadow loomed over her, closing in like a cloud of smoke. Ethan and Jake rushed forward, trying to pull her back, but the air around them grew thick, almost solid, trapping them in place. As Marigold's form circled Dr. Grace, a wild, gleeful laugh filled the air, echoing off the trees. The dark mist began to spread, crawling along the ground, wrapping around the group like tendrils, tightening with each passing second. In the middle of it all, Rachel's voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. "Ethan, help me!" Ethan turned, his heart pounding. Rachel had followed them, her face twisted in pain, her eyes filled with terror. She staggered toward him, her hands clutching at her head as if fighting an invisible force. "Please, she won't let go. I can't fight her." Dr. Grace struggled to her feet, her face pale but resolute. She held out her hands, chanting louder, trying to push back the mist to sever Marigold's hold on Rachel. "Rachel, you have to fight her. Don't let her take control. Focus on my voice. Hold on to yourself." But Rachel's face contorted, her eyes flashing with that same unnatural darkness. Her lips twisted into a smile, and when she spoke, her voice was no longer her own. "Rachel is gone," Marigold sneered, her voice echoing through Rachel's body. "You cannot save her. This body belongs to me now." Ethan's hands trembled, desperation flooding him as he looked into Rachel's face. His Rachel, the woman he loved, now lost behind a mask of rage and hatred. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Come back. I know you're in there." Rachel's eyes flickered, her gaze softening for a split second, as if she were fighting her way back. But Marigold's grip tightened, and with a scream, Rachel collapsed to her knees, clutching her head, the spirit's anger radiating through her like a shockwave. Dr. Grace moved closer, her voice unwavering. "Marigold, listen to me. This place is sacred to you, but this body is not yours. Release her, or we will banish you." A fierce wind whipped through the clearing, snuffing out the candles in one swift breath. Shadows closed in, the mist rising in thick, writhing columns around them. Marigold's laugh echoed again, louder, more menacing. "You are nothing to me. You cannot command me." Ethan and Jake tried to hold on to Rachel, but the force of Marigold's spirit pushed them back, sending them stumbling. Rachel's face twisted in agony as Marigold fought for full control, her body convulsing, her voice a guttural growl. Lily's voice broke through the chaos, desperate. "There has to be another way. Dr. Grace, what do we do?" Dr. Grace's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched the fallen sage, whispering another chant, this one softer, more pleading. "Marigold, if you will not leave, then let us offer you peace." The chant faltered, but Dr. Grace raised her voice, repeating it, her tone filled with desperation. The mist seemed to recoil, hesitating, as if Marigold's spirit was finally listening. But the moment was fleeting. Rachel's face contorted into a grin, her voice mocking. "Peace? There is no peace for me. I will never rest. I will take them all." Suddenly, Rachel's body arched backward, her mouth open in a silent scream. The fog twisted around her, spiraling upward, as Marigold's spirit began to fully integrate, claiming her as a vessel. Dr. Grace stepped forward, raising her hand in one last, desperate attempt to break the possession. "Marigold, in the name of peace, I release you from this pain." Dr. Grace's voice rang out, commanding, powerful. There was a moment of silence, the world holding its breath. Then, with a final scream, Rachel collapsed to the ground, the fog lifting, dispersing as quickly as it had come. She lay still, her breathing shallow, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Ethan rushed to her side, pulling her into his arms. "Rachel! Rachel, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused. "Ethan, what happened? I feel so cold." Dr. Grace knelt beside them, her voice soft. "Marigold has been driven back, but her spirit remains bound to these woods. We may have weakened her, but she will never be at rest until her story is told." Rachel clung to Ethan, her body trembling. I saw her, Ethan. She was there in my mind. She showed me everything." "What do you mean?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rachel looked up, her eyes filled with a strange, haunted understanding. "Marigold, she won't leave until we go to the place where she died. That's where it has to end." Dr. Grace nodded solemnly. "Then we have no choice. If we don't put her to rest, her spirit will haunt these woods forever, and she may not release Rachel the next time." As the wind stirred the trees around them, they knew there was only one path forward, to confront Marigold where she had drawn her last breath. The forest had taken on an unnatural stillness as they set off deeper into the woods, moving cautiously, each step heavy with dread. Shadows crept between the trees, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the sharp snap of a twig, the distant call of an owl. Guided by Rachel's fragmented memories of Marigold's final moments, they moved in silence, alert to every shift in the forest around them. Dr. Grace led the way, her face set in a grim mask of determination, a flashlight in one hand and a thick bundle of sage in the other. She'd drawn symbols of protection on their wrists before they set out, assuring them that it would help shield them from Marigold's wrath. But Ethan felt the weight of the woods pressing in, heavy and hostile, like the spirit was lurking in every shadow, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Are we getting close?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Rachel hesitated, her gaze unfocused as she tried to piece together the fragmented visions that had come to her when Marigold's spirit had invaded her mind. It's somewhere near an old well. That's where she was abandoned. I keep seeing it, over and over. It was the last place she saw before she died. Ethan glanced around, his nerves frayed. A well? In the middle of nowhere? Dr. Grace nodded solemnly. Many years ago, small wells dotted these woods, used by the homesteaders who lived here. When they left, the wells were abandoned and forgotten. Marigold's family left her near one, far from the main path. It's a cruel way to go, dying alone, abandoned by those she trusted. Rachel flinched at the thought, her eyes clouded with a mix of pity and fear. I can feel her anger, her pain. She was betrayed by her own family, and she wants everyone to feel that same isolation. The trees grew denser as they walked, branches twisting into claw-like shapes that seemed to reach for them. The ground sloped downward, the forest thickening into an almost impenetrable wall of darkness. Ethan held onto Rachel's hand, his grip tightening as they descended, his every instinct screaming to turn back. After what felt like hours, they saw it, a circle of stones barely visible in the moonlight, surrounding the mouth of an ancient crumbling well. The stones were covered in moss, and the well's wooden frame had rotted to splinters. The air around it was thick, charged with a dark energy that made every hair on Ethan's neck stand on end. "This is it," Dr. Grace murmured, stopping at the edge of the circle. "This is where she died." Rachel shuddered, clutching Ethan's hand tightly. "I can feel her. She's here." The group gathered around the well, forming a protective ring, and Dr. Grace began the ritual, her voice rising in a steady chant. She lit the sage, the pungent smoke swirling in the night air, forming a protective barrier around them. The flames from their candles flickered wildly, as if caught in an invisible wind. As Dr. Grace chanted, the darkness seemed to pulse, thickening around them. A low, keening sound filled the air, growing louder, sharper, until it was nearly unbearable. A wail of grief and fury that echoed through the forest, rattling the trees. Rachel's grip on Ethan's hand tightened, her eyes widening in fear. "She's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's angry." The shadows shifted, coalescing into the form of a woman standing on the other side of the well. Her figure was draped in tattered, dark fabric, her face hidden in shadow, but her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, filled with hate and sorrow. "Why do you disturb me?" Marigold's voice was a low, venomous whisper that seemed to come from every direction at once. "I was left here to rot, forgotten, abandoned, and now you dare come here to finish what they started." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry, but Dr. Grace held firm. "Marigold," she called, her voice steady, "we know of your suffering, and we seek to give you peace. Release this girl, let her go, and we will honor you, remember you." Marigold's face twisted into a sneer. "Peace? Honor? They left me here, my own blood. No one remembers. No one cares." Rachel, her face pale and haunted, spoke up, her voice trembling. "Marigold, I know what it's like to feel abandoned, to feel like you're all alone. But this isn't the way. You don't need to keep hurting others. Let go, and we'll make sure your story is told." For a moment, Marigold's expression softened, her gaze flickering with something that looked almost like longing. But then her eyes hardened, and she laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Words, empty words. You think you can soothe me with promises. I am beyond your pity." The ground trembled, and a freezing wind whipped through the clearing, extinguishing the candles. Shadows spilled from the well, dark tendrils that twisted and writhed, reaching out toward them. Ethan felt a sharp, icy grip close around his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Beside him, Rachel gasped, clutching her head as if in pain. "Stay together!" Dr. Grace shouted, raising her voice over the howling wind. "Don't break the circle!" But Marigold's fury was relentless. The shadows clawed at them, icy tendrils wrapping around their arms and legs, pulling them closer to the well. Ethan struggled, his vision blurring, his body growing numb with cold. He glanced at Rachel, who was fighting to stay upright, her face contorted with pain as Marigold's spirit tried to reclaim her. "Rachel!" Ethan shouted, reaching for her. "You have to fight! Don't let her take you!" Rachel's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of terror and determination. She gritted her teeth, pushing back against the invisible force pulling her toward the well. "I won't! Let her win!" Dr. Grace's chant grew louder, more urgent, her voice filled with a raw, desperate power. "Marigold, I call upon you to release this girl. Let go of your hatred, your pain. Go to your rest," Marigold screamed, a sound that pierced the night, filled with centuries of agony and rage. Her form flickered, dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows that hovered over the well, writhing and twisting as if caught between worlds. The ground shook, and the stones around the well began to crack, splitting open as if unable to contain the darkness within. Ethan stumbled, grabbing Rachel's hand as they backed away, the shadows swirling around them, closing in. "Stay strong!" Dr. Grace shouted. "She's weakening! Just a little longer!" But Marigold wasn't done. With one final furious scream, her shadow lunged toward them, engulfing them in darkness. Ethan felt himself falling, his body pulled into a suffocating void, cold and empty. He tried to call out, but his voice was lost in the darkness. Then, through the blackness, he heard Rachel's voice, faint but steady. "Marigold, please, I understand your pain. Let me help you find peace." The shadows around them stilled, quivering as if in response to her words. Slowly, the darkness receded, pulling back like a tide, leaving them gasping on the cold ground. Marigold's form hovered above the well, her gaze locked on Rachel, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the anger in her eyes faded, replaced by something softer, almost mournful. "Peace," she whispered, her voice a faint echo. "Will I ever find it?" Rachel took a trembling step forward, her voice filled with compassion. "You can, but you have to let go." Marigold's figure flickered, her form dissolving into wisps of smoke. She looked at them one last time, her gaze lingering on Rachel. "Remember me," she whispered, her voice filled with a sadness that cut through the night. Then, with a final sigh, she vanished, her spirit dissipating into the cold air, leaving the forest silent once more. Dr. Grace collapsed to her knees, breathing heavily. "It's done. She's finally gone." Ethan wrapped his arms around Rachel, holding her close as they sat in the quiet darkness, the weight of the ordeal settling over them. For the first time since they had arrived, the forest felt still, peaceful. As they made their way back to the cabin, a faint glow began to rise in the east, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. They walked in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, knowing they had witnessed something beyond explanation, an ancient spirit, finally laid to rest. They returned to the cabin, weary but relieved, and packed their things in silence, eager to leave the haunted woods behind. As they drove away, Rachel glanced back at the forest, a strange sense of calm settling over her. Marigold was gone, but her story would live on, remembered and honored, just as she had wanted. And as the morning light washed over the trees, Ethan felt a quiet sense of closure, knowing they had done what they had come here to do. They had put the spirit of Marigold to rest, freeing both her and themselves from the darkness of the past. Dawn was spreading a soft glow over the Oregon mountains as Ethan, Rachel, Lily and Jake made their way back to the cabin for the last time. The silence among them felt heavy, not from fear anymore, but from the immense relief that it was finally over. Marigold was gone, her presence lifted from the forest, and a strange, almost reverent quiet settled over the woods. The cabin, once cold and hostile, seemed different now, less foreboding, almost benign in the morning light. Dr. Grace remained solemn as she helped them pack, her every movement quiet and deliberate, as though she, too, was reflecting on what they had just survived. Rachel was the first to speak as she zipped her duffel bag, breaking the silence that had lingered since they'd left the clearing. I don't know how to thank you, Dr. Grace. You helped us. You saved me." Dr. Grace smiled faintly, her hand resting on Rachel's shoulder. Sometimes spirits need to be heard, to have their suffering understood. Marigold's spirit held on to this place for a reason. It was her prison, but now it's also her peace. Rachel's face softened, her eyes filled with something deeper than relief, a strange empathy, a shared sorrow for Marigold. "I can still feel her, not in a bad way, just like she's finally at rest." The group exchanged weary smiles, their faces lined with exhaustion, but also something close to gratitude. They had faced something impossible, something that had forced them to confront not only Marigold's pain, but their own vulnerabilities, their own fears. They piled their bags into the car, each of them moving slowly, reluctant to make any noise louder than a whisper, as though afraid of disturbing the fragile peace that now hung over the forest. As Ethan started the engine, he glanced back at Dr. Grace, who stood by the cabin, watching them with an unreadable expression. "Will you be all right out here, Doctor?" "Grace?" he asked, leaning out the window. She gave a slow nod, her eyes still on the cabin. "I've been dealing with spirits a long time, but this was one of the hardest. She fought because she was forgotten, and all she wanted was to be remembered. You've given her that." Lily leaned out, her brow furrowed. "How can we be sure that she's really gone?" Dr. Grace's expression softened. "Spirits who find peace rarely return. Marigold's pain has been heard. That's what matters. Go in peace, and know you did what she needed." The friends nodded, comforted, if only slightly. As they drove away, Rachel looked back one last time at the forest, a strange, haunting beauty settling over the trees, the mist lifting as dawn cast long rays through the branches. She knew that Marigold's spirit would linger in her memory, a reminder of what they had faced, of the woman who had been left to die alone, but had finally been set free. The drive home was quiet. Exhausted, each of them fell into their thoughts, processing the events of the last 2 days. Every shadow by the roadside, every passing tree, seemed to hold some reminder of Marigold's curse. For Rachel, the experience was especially raw, fragments of Marigold's rage and sorrow still clinging to her, like an aftertaste. But for the first time since the possession, she felt in control again, herself unburdened. Hours later, they pulled into Ethan's driveway. They each unloaded their bags, the familiar sight of suburbia, a strange contrast to the dark, haunting woods they'd left behind. Lily gave a relieved laugh, the sound cracking the tension in the air. "Home," she said, taking a deep breath. "We made it." They exchanged shaky smiles, each of them realizing how close they'd come to losing one another, to losing themselves. In a small but meaningful way, they were bonded, tied together by the experience they had just shared. Ethan turned to Rachel, his hand brushing her arm. "Are you all right?" Rachel hesitated, her gaze distant. "I will be. I think part of Marigold is still with me, in my memories, but I'll be okay." She looked up, managing a soft smile. She just wanted her story to be told, and we'll remember her. Ethan hugged her, holding her close. "We're safe now. It's over." Dr. Grace had been right. The spirit of Marigold had moved on, but the memory of her, the weight of her story, would remain with them, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and survived. That night, after her friends had left, Rachel sat alone in her room, feeling a strange sense of calm she hadn't felt in days. She looked around at the familiar objects on her shelves, her books, her photos, the life that was hers again. The fear and turmoil of the last few days were finally starting to recede, but Marigold's memory lingered. On impulse, she pulled out her journal, opened it to a fresh page, and began to write. She wrote everything she could remember: the details of Marigold's life, her tragic end, the anger that had driven her to haunt the forest. She wrote until her hand cramped, until her mind was empty and her heart lighter. She would not let Marigold be forgotten again. As she finished, Rachel felt a strange warmth settle over her, a gentle presence, almost like a thank you. She glanced around, half expecting to see Marigold's ghostly figure, but there was nothing there, only a peaceful silence, soft and comforting. Rachel closed her journal and whispered into the quiet, "Rest in peace, Marigold." She lay back on her bed, her eyes drifting shut, the remnants of fear melting into sleep. In her dreams, she saw the forest, bright and serene under the morning light, free of shadows, at peace at last. A few weeks later, Rachel and her friends gathered around a fire pit in Ethan's backyard, sharing drinks and laughs, trying to shake off the last of the darkness that had followed them. They spoke of lighter things, avoiding any mention of the cabin, the forest, the terror they had faced together. But as the fire crackled, Ethan cleared his throat, glancing at the others. "I know we agreed not to talk about it, but I think Marigold would want us to remember her." The group fell silent, each of them exchanging glances, recognizing the truth in his words. Jake nodded slowly, his face solemn. "Yeah, we owe her that much." Rachel smiled, feeling a calmness settle over her as they remembered Marigold, her tragic story, her final release. For the first time there was no fear, only peace, a life remembered, a spirit laid to rest. And as the last embers of the fire faded into the night, they sat in a comfortable silence together, each of them knowing that they had witnessed something rare and powerful, a haunting they would never forget, and a spirit who would remain with them, not as a shadow, but as a memory of resilience, a testament to those who refuse to be forgotten. The curse of Marigold was over, and in its place there was peace. So, friends, today's story ends here, and this was a story based on real events, and I hope you will feel a lot of fear. Well, how interesting did you find the story? Tell me in the comment. And yes, very soon I am going to bring a new story for you based on another real incident. Till then, goodbye, and keep subscribing to the channel.